When Jesus was asked for a sign, he said, I give you the sign of Jonah. He points to the book of Jonah and all of its contents, in my opinion. So there's a lot of parts in the book of Jonah that could be considered a sign or a miracle. I personally feel it's a short enough book. Jesus obviously understood the book very well, so that it's my recommendation that you include the whole book, all of the different messages in the book of Jonah, as part of what Jesus is pointing to. I hope that I'm being clear here, because there are, again, many, many little spots in the book of Jonah that you could point to and say, that's a miracle, or that's what Jesus is talking about. But the whole collection of messages and incidences in the book of Jonah, I think, are part of what he was talking about. Is it a true story? Did Jonah dictate this to a scribe, or did he read it? Or did Jonah write it himself after it happened? It's got a very straightforward beginning, but a very unusual ending. It's almost anticlimactic. There's no happily ever after sort of ending to the book of Jonah. Is some of it missing at the end? It's really hard to discern that. Maybe you've read it. If you haven't, it's a short read and well worth it. It's just loaded with different things that you can go back and reflect on. The first chapter is just jam-packed, where he runs away from God to get away from his duty that God just told him to go to Nineveh and help evangelize, for lack of a better term, the entire city of Nineveh, which was enormous back then. So he is in a boat with sailors who didn't believe in God, that Judeo-Christian God that we call Yahweh and that I believe in and know as my creator. There's a storm. He's pitched out of the boat, and he admits that he's at fault. The sailors that don't believe throw him out. But when the storm abates and they're safe, they turn to God. They made a sacrifice to him, and they promised to serve him. That's an interesting part of the story, because if Jonah's already out of the boat, how would he have known that the storm subsided and that the non-believing sailors now believe and serve God? Who would have been there to write that down? This really is a pivotal part of this particular book, because it makes you wonder who wrote it and if it's true story or not. I'll let you decide all that. I just want to let you know it's an important part of the book, because it does show that people see signs and wonders, and then they will turn to God because it's just so overwhelming. Chapter 2 is an intense prayer. This prayer is specific because of his condition, that he goes into the water. You may consider it baptism. I would submit that there is a baptismal and rebirth sort of function going on here, not just terror. Read this prayer. It is, in a way, a death and rebirth sort of experience for Jonah. Obviously a miracle. He gets plopped out into the dry ground and fulfills his service to God as God has dictated it to him. The concept of going from one end of Nineveh to the next, preaching and being heard. Consider going into any big city right now, trying to go from one side to the other, just preaching, reaching out to people and proclaiming God's coming. It could be any way that you feel like you're displaying the message to people, the sign or verbally. How would you be treated? How would you be embraced? At what point would one leader or another recognize what you're saying as being valid and embrace what you're saying, and then support you to the point where the entire city is commanded to change its ways and to come back to God? It's a very, very hard thing to consider, especially back then. It's absolutely going to be on foot. It's a small voice in a big area. It would be very hard for people to pay attention to you. How would you be treated if you were just in a small town? If you went through and started warning people that, God is coming and he is going to judge you very harshly if you don't change your ways, how would you be received? It's a very, very difficult thing that was given to Jonah to do. God obviously saw into the future and recognized beforehand that Jonah would be well received, knew exactly what would happen, and it was a miracle that people did change their lives. And Jesus also said that the world today would be judged harshly by the people of Nineveh because they heard and they obeyed. And so we reflect on this message of Jonah today as being very, very contemporary. And I think that's what God had in mind, that for the sake of one person, that we would change our ways. And that one person Maybe Jonah is a symbol of Jesus. Maybe Jonah is a symbol of somebody that's very, very small in the eyes of the world. Kind of hard to say, but in either way, are we willing to listen? Are we willing to embrace this message? Are we willing to change who we are for the better? Not just because some king or ruler tells us to, but maybe because they tell us to, and then that resonates in our heart somewhere. Fantastic story. Bizarre ending. Jonah does all this work and he's kind of upset that the city is actually saved. He's like, geez, I did all this stuff and you were going to save him anyway, so why did you even have me do it? Kind of arguing with God here in the end of the story. It's whimsical in one hand if you just look at him and judge him for who he is, but are we doing the same thing? So let's turn our eyes on Jesus and say to ourselves, hey, I sometimes am disgusted with the way things are. Maybe God could do this better, sort of thing. Jesus and Jonah have the same sort of thing where they look up to God and say, why? They have a moment or two where they're just sort of hoping that things get better without any more trouble. So it's an important thing to realize that they're a human being and he has emotions. And no matter what God has shown him, he is a little arrogant, I suppose, despondent that more justice wasn't served. Certain things that we can think about today that we might experience ourselves. I like the very ending of the book where God feels sorry for the children. 120,000 innocent children would have been killed. Also the animals. So God cares about the animals. So he's like, all of this life would have been destroyed if it wasn't for you. And God is reassuring him that he was part of a really nice thing that happened. And I think that's a great end of the story. We don't know what happens after that. What happens to Jonah? Does he go home? We just don't know. No matter what version or translation you read this in, it's just very, very jam-packed. If it's a fictional book or it's a factual book, I don't know. But to me, I want to learn from it. And I certainly have. I hope you do too.